The rifle shot echoed through the Appalachian hollows like a church bell, tolling for the dead. Nathaniel Blackwood stood over the fallen buck, a magnificent 12-point stag that had lived long enough to grow wise but not wise enough to avoid the 44 caliber round from his Winchester 1873. The animal's chest rose one final time, then settled into the stillness that separates the living from memory. Nate didn't look at his kill. His eyes were fixed on the column of black smoke rising from the valley 3 miles distant, where his land met the timber claims of men who believed ownership was a matter of power rather than paper. The smoke twisted in the October wind like a serpent, and Nathaniel knew what it meant. 5 years of uneasy peace had just ended. He was 34 years old, though the mountains had carved him into something that looked both younger and infinitely older. His beard grew thick and black, reaching halfway down his chest in the way of men who lived too far from barbers and too close to survival. Hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather cut from a deer he'd taken the previous winter. A scar ran from his collarbone to his navel, a reminder of the night 5 years ago when the world had burned and taken everything he loved with it. He stood 6 feet 2 inches in his worn boots, weighing near 200 pounds, all of it muscle and tendon, and the kind of strength that comes from splitting wood and hauling water and living in a place where weakness meant death. The memory came unbidden, as it always did when he saw smoke. Caroline's screams, the timber frame of their cabin collapsing in a shower of sparks. His daughter Grace, only 3 years old, thrust into his arms by a dying woman whose last act was to save the child she'd carried and loved. The flames had taken Caroline Blackwood on a November night in 1873, and they'd taken his daughter's voice with her. Grace hadn't spoken a word since. Not a cry, not a whisper, just silence, deep and profound as a grave. Nate secured the buck to his horse, a Kentucky saddler named Smoke for the color of his coat and the way he moved through timber like morning fog. The animal knew the way home without guidance, picking through the scree and laurel thickets with the sure-footedness of an Appalachian native. They descended through hemlock forests where the light fell in cathedral shafts, across ridges where the wind spoke in tongues older than the Cherokee who'd once called these mountains home. When he reached the clearing where his cabin stood, he found his daughter sitting on the porch steps, clutching the wooden doll he'd carved for her last winter. The doll's face was worn smooth from constant handling, and Grace held it the way a drowning man holds driftwood. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a woman dressed in black, severe and out of place as a raven at a baptism. The woman wore the habit of a nun, the white coif framing a face that was neither beautiful nor plain, but simply determined. Her eyes were green, the color of new leaves, and they met his without flinching as he dismounted and pulled the Winchester from its saddle scabbard. "Who gave you permission to step onto my land?" His voice came out flat and cold, the way he'd learned to speak after Caroline died. No inflection, no invitation for response, just statement and threat combined. "Father Calloway." The woman stood, brushing dust from her black dress with hands that showed evidence of work. "He passed this morning. He left a will and a letter for you." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. He knew Father Edmund Calloway, the old priest who ran the Baptist mission 20 miles south. The man had been kind to him after Caroline's death, one of the few who hadn't looked at Nathaniel like he was a bomb waiting to explode. But that kindness didn't explain why a nun was standing on his porch. "Show me." The woman reached into a leather satchel and produced an envelope, sealed with wax that bore Calloway's mark. Nathaniel took it without touching her hand, broke the seal, and read by the fading afternoon light. The letter was written in Calloway's failing script, each word a labor against palsy and age. But the message came through clear as spring water. "Nathaniel, my son, though not by blood, I have kept this secret for 30 years, and my silence has been both my greatest sin and my most cherished protection. Your mother, Sarah Blackwood, was my younger sister. When she bore you out of wedlock to a Cherokee hunter, our family cast her out. I was young then, newly ordained, and I chose the collar over my own blood. That choice has haunted me every day since. But I have not left you unprotected. Using every dollar I saved in 30 years of service, I purchased 500 acres in your name. The deed is registered as number 1947 in the clerk's office in Knoxville. This land is worth $50,000, Nathaniel, and Judge Cornelius Thorne knows it. 5 years ago, Thorne's men set fire to your cabin, killing Caroline. They meant to drive you off the land so Thorne could claim it. But you did not break. You buried your wife and you stayed. Stayed. And that resistance has eaten at Thorne like rot in timber. Now he has found a new weapon. He has filed a petition with the court claiming you are unfit to be a father. He says that Grace's silence is evidence of neglect, of mental instability. He has bribed a doctor to write reports claiming you pose a danger. If he wins this case, he will become Grace's legal guardian. And guardian status includes control over the child's property. Your land will become his. The hearing is set for 28 days from now. I cannot fight him from the grave, but I have found you an ally. Sister Abigail Rosehart stands before you now. She was cast out from the Sisters of Charity for refusing to keep silent when the Mother Superior embezzled funds meant for the poor. She is honest, brave, and in need of sanctuary. Tennessee law states that a widowed father cannot maintain custody of a daughter without a legal female presence in the household. I have arranged nothing, Nathaniel, but I offer you a choice. Marriage to Sister Abigail would void Thorne's petition. Refusal means Grace will be taken to the county orphanage within 30 days, and your land will fall to Thorne by default. This is not a sale, it is an alliance. The decision is yours. But remember this, a true man is not one who feels no fear. He is one who does what is right despite being afraid. I love you, my boy. I always have. Edmund. Nathaniel read the letter twice, then let his hand fall to his side. The paper crinkled in his grip, and for a moment the only sound was wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk. He told you what's in this letter? His eyes found the nun again, searching for deception or pity or any of the things he'd learned to hate in the years since Caroline died. He did. Her voice was steady, neither defensive nor pleading. I don't expect you to trust me, Mr. Blackwood, but I can tell you this, I have nowhere else to go. The church cast me out for speaking truth. Your priest offered me shelter and purpose. I accepted both. I don't need a wife. The words came out harder than he intended. I need a lawyer. Do you know who owns the lawyers in this county? She took a step forward, and he noticed she moved like someone used to hard floors and long hours on her feet. A nurse, Calloway's letter had mentioned. She'd been a nurse during the fever epidemic of '76. Judge Thorne owns the magistrate, the sheriff, and every attorney within 50 miles. The only thing you have that he doesn't is time. She reached into her satchel again and produced a legal document. The seal of the circuit court was pressed into the bottom, and the words were written in the careful copperplate of a court clerk. Summons to appear, guardian hearing, 28 days hence. Night fell over the Appalachian Ridge like a curtain, sudden and complete. Nathaniel sent the nun to sleep in the barn over her protests. She'd argued that propriety demanded she stay in the house where Grace could see her, but he'd shut that down with a look. This was his land, his home, his choice. If she wanted sanctuary, she'd take it on his terms. But sleep wouldn't come for him. He sat beside Grace's bed, watching his daughter clutch the wooden doll and mouth words that never became sound. Her lips moved in the shapes of prayers or pleas or simply the desperate attempt to speak that haunted her waking hours. At 8 years old, she should have been chattering like the creek after rain, full of questions and laughter and all the noise of childhood. Instead, she was silent as the grave that held her mother. He'd made Caroline a promise the night she died. Her last words, gasped through lungs filled with smoke and failing will, had been simple and absolute. Protect her, Nate. Don't let anyone take her from you. Promise me. He'd promised, and he'd kept that promise through 5 years of isolation and grief and the slow, grinding work of survival. But now Thorne had found a weapon Nathaniel couldn't fight with his rifle or his knife or his fists. The law, the court, the machinery of civilization that ground down men like him and spat them out as examples. When dawn broke, he found Sister Abigail already awake, grooming Smoke with practiced hands. She'd found the curry comb in the tack room, and the horse stood easy under her ministrations, which told Nathaniel something important. Smoke didn't tolerate fools or cruelty. If the horse accepted her, maybe she was worth the risk. I'll do it. He spoke without preamble, standing in the barn doorway with the morning sun at his back. But this is a business arrangement. You help me keep Grace. I give you shelter and protection. No love, no intimacy. She turned to face him, curry comb still in hand. Up close in good light, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 29, 30 at most. Her face bore the kind of weathering that came from hard work rather than age, and her hands were calloused in ways that spoke of labor. I took a vow of chastity when I entered the convent. Her voice was matter of fact, neither embarrassed nor defiant. That vow stands regardless of any marriage certificate, but I have one condition of my own. Name it. I will teach Grace to read and write, and you will treat me as a partner in this household, not a servant. He studied her for a long moment, looking for the catch, the hidden angle, but her eyes held steady and he found himself nodding. Agreed. They shook hands. Her grip was firm, her palm rough with calluses. It was a handshake between equals, between two people who understood that survival sometimes meant accepting help from unexpected places. The wedding took place 3 days later at a tiny Baptist chapel 10 miles from the nearest settlement. Reverend Joshua Mills performed the ceremony with Doc Henry Pritchard as witness, along with Jake Whitmore, Nathaniel's 19-year-old nephew who'd come to live with them after his own parents died in a mining accident. Grace stood between Nathaniel and Abigail, holding both their hands with a grip that spoke of desperate hope. There were no flowers, no music. Abigail wore her black nun's habit because it was the only formal clothing she owned. Nathaniel wore his hunting coat, still carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and deer blood in the mountains that had shaped him. The Reverend's voice echoed in the small space, speaking words about sickness and health, wealth and poverty, till death do us part. When Mills reached the critical question, there was a long pause. 5 seconds of silence that felt like 5 years. Nathaniel looked at Grace, seeing Caroline's eyes in his daughter's face, and he thought about the promise he'd made. Protect her. Don't let anyone take her. I do. Abigail's response came clear and steady. I do. Mills cleared his throat. You may kiss the bride. Abigail turned her face away before Nathaniel could move. He didn't protest. This wasn't that kind of marriage, and both of them knew it. They rode back to this cabin in silence, Grace sitting in front of Abigail on smoke while Nathaniel and Jake walked alongside. The October air held the sharp promise of winter, and the leaves were turning the colors of fire. In other circumstances, it might have been beautiful. But beauty was a luxury Nathaniel had learned to do without. Night fell like a stone. The cabin had only one bedroom, a simple space barely large enough for the rope-frame bed and a chest for clothes. Nathaniel pointed at it. You sleep there. Grace, Jake, and I will take the main room floor. Abigail shook her head. No, if anyone is watching, they need to see you sleeping in the house, near your wife. Grace and I will share the bedroom. You and Jake take the floor in the main room. He started to argue, then stopped. Her logic was sound. If Thorne had spies watching, and he certainly did, they'd be looking for evidence that the marriage was a sham. A husband who slept in the barn while his new wife stayed in the house would raise exactly the kind of questions they couldn't afford. Fine. He left them to settle in and went to check the property lines, walking the perimeter in the dark with just starlight to guide him. It was something he did most nights, a patrol born of 5 years of vigilance. Thorne's men had tried to encroach twice in the past year, moving fence posts and cutting timber on land that wasn't theirs. Each time, Nathaniel had caught them and sent them running with warning shots and threats that weren't empty. When he returned to the cabin near midnight, the house was dark and quiet. He bedded down on the floor near the fireplace, using his coat as a blanket and his saddle as a pillow. Jake snored softly in the corner, already deep in the sleep of youth. Nathaniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the night. Owl call, wind through gaps in the chinking. The creak and settle of timber as the house adjusted to the cold. Then, at 2 in the morning, Grace screamed. It was the only sound she made anymore. That scream. Not words, not crying, just a raw howl of terror that came from wherever nightmares lived. Nathaniel was on his feet and through the bedroom door before the echo faded, knife in hand, ready to kill whatever had frightened his daughter. But there was no threat. Only Grace thrashing in the bed, caught in the same dream that had haunted her for 5 years. The dream of fire and falling timbers and her mother's final scream. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed, gathering the child into her arms, and began to sing. The song was Latin, something from the Maces. Ave Maria. Her voice was clear and surprisingly pure, each note measured and deliberate, as if the melody itself could build a wall between Grace and her nightmares. The child's thrashing slowed, then stopped. Her breathing eased. The terror drained from her face, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Nathaniel stood frozen in the doorway, watching this woman he barely knew comfort his daughter with a competence that spoke of practice. She didn't look up at him, didn't acknowledge his presence. All her attention was focused on Grace, on the rhythm of the song and the steady pressure of her embrace. When the song ended, Grace's eyes were closed, her breathing deep and even. Abigail carefully laid her back on the pillow, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and finally looked at Nathaniel. No words passed between them, but something shifted in that moment, some understanding that went deeper than their business arrangement. This woman had seen his daughter's pain and responded not with pity, but with action. She'd known what to do because she'd done it before, probably for dozens of sick children in the charity hospitals where she'd worked. Nathaniel backed out of the room and returned to his place by the fire. But he didn't sleep. He lay there thinking about Caroline, about the promise he'd made, about this stranger who was now legally his wife. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in the ashes of his grief. The first week of their arrangement passed in a careful dance of boundaries and unspoken rules. Abigail rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, working with the limited supplies in the cabin's larder. She made porridge from cornmeal and wild onions, seasoned with salt and nothing else. When Nathaniel and Jake sat down to eat, they stared at their bowls with the confusion of men encountering food that bore no resemblance to sustenance. Jake whispered, loud enough to carry, "Uncle Nate, is this what they feed chickens?" Nathaniel took a spoonful, chewed thoughtfully, and set down his spoon. "Eat it. Don't waste food." But Abigail had heard. That evening, she roasted venison from the buck Nathaniel had killed, using techniques she'd observed in his preparations but adding touches of her own. Herbs from the forest, careful attention to the fire. When she served it, Nathaniel took a bite and gave the smallest of nods. Better. It was the first compliment he'd offered in 5 years, and Abigail accepted it with the same matter-of-fact nod she'd given their wedding vows. She began teaching Grace to read using the only book in the house, a worn Bible that had belonged to Carolyn. Nathaniel objected immediately. "I don't want her learning religion. I prayed when Caroline died." "God didn't listen. I'm not teaching religion." Abigail's voice was calm, brooking no argument. "I'm teaching letters. If you have another book, I'll use that." He did, as it happened, a copy of the leather-stocking tales that he'd carried since his own youth, the pages dog-eared and water-stained. Abigail took it without comment and began Grace's lessons that afternoon, pointing to words and having the child trace letters in the dirt with a stick. The evenings fell into a pattern. Nathaniel would work on equipment, repairing traps and sharpening blades. Abigail would sew or mend clothes by lamplight. Grace would draw pictures with charcoal on scraps of wood, creating images of trees and animals and, once, a family of 3 figures holding hands. Jake would clean the rifles, applying oil with the careful attention Nathaniel had taught him. No one spoke much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was the comfortable quiet of people who'd learned to exist in proximity without friction, the kind of peace that came from understanding boundaries. On Sunday morning, Nathaniel made the announcement, "We're going to church." Jake looked up in surprise. Nathaniel hadn't set foot in a church since Caroline's funeral, but Abigail understood immediately, to show that we're a proper family, to show Thorne we're not afraid. They rode into the town of Morganville just as the church bells started ringing. The settlement was barely worthy of the name, just a cluster of buildings around a crossroads where timber money met mountain poverty. The church was the finest structure, white-painted wood with a bell tower that could be heard 5 miles away on a clear morning. Every head turned as they entered. Nathaniel Blackwood hadn't been seen in town since the fire, and his sudden appearance with a wife and daughter in tow set off a wave of whispers that rolled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Judge Cornelius Thorne sat in the front pew, the position of honor reserved for the church's largest benefactor. He was 58 years old, built like a wall with shoulders that strained his expensive coat and hands that could crush walnuts. His face was weathered and hard, The face of a man who'd taken what he wanted for 30 years and never once doubted his right to do so. When Nathaniel walked down the aisle, Thorne turned and offered a smile that held no warmth. "Blackwood, I hear you've remarried, quite suddenly. Congratulations." His voice carried through the church, loud enough that everyone could hear. "I hope this isn't an attempt to circumvent certain legal proceedings." Abigail spoke before Nathaniel could respond, her voice clear and sharp as broken glass. "Judge Thorne, I once treated 50 patients during the fever epidemic of 1876. I learned to recognize sickness in that time, both sickness of the body and sickness of the soul." The church went absolutely silent. A nun had just publicly called a judge spiritually diseased. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Thorne's smile disappeared. "Sister, you would do well to remember that I am an officer of the court. And you would do well to remember that I am an officer of conscience." She met his gaze without flinching. "The court answers to law. Conscience answers to God." The service passed in tense silence. Reverend Mills preached about mercy and judgment, though his eyes kept flicking nervously between Thorne and Nathaniel, as if expecting violence to erupt mid-sermon. When the final hymn ended, Sheriff Tom Brady appeared at Nathaniel's elbow before they could leave. Brady was 50 years old, soft around the middle, with the perpetual squint of a man who'd spent too long looking the other way. He carried a leather folder, which he handed to Nathaniel with an expression that tried to convey regret, but mostly showed relief that he wasn't the one on trial. "Court summons. Preliminary hearing set for 3 weeks from today. Judge presiding will be, Judge Thorne. He can't be the judge in his own case." Nathaniel's voice was flat, dangerous. "He's the only circuit judge in 3 counties. Law says he can preside unless there's proof of bias." Nathaniel started to respond, but Abigail's hand on his arm stopped him. She took the summons and read it carefully, her eyes moving over the legal language with the attention of someone who understood exactly what was being said. "This also includes a medical report." Her voice had gone cold. "From a Dr. James Harrow claiming Grace suffers from severe psychological trauma due to neglect." "That's a lie." Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists. "Grace's silence came from watching her mother burn, not from anything I did." Brady shifted uncomfortably. "That's for the court to decide. Harrow's a licensed physician. His word carries weight. And Thorne pays his salary." Abigail's statement hung in the air like an accusation. "This is a coordinated attack. The petition, the medical report, the judge presiding over his own case. It's designed to be unbeatable." Brady didn't confirm or deny. He simply tipped his hat and walked away, moving with the careful speed of a man fleeing a fire. They rode home in silence. Grace sat in front of Abigail, her small hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckle intensity. Jake rode behind them, his young face showing the kind of rage that comes before wisdom teaches a man to hide it. Nathaniel led them, his eyes scanning the tree line out of habit, watching for the ambush that his gut told him was coming. It came that night. Nathaniel heard them before he saw them. The sound of horses moving through brush, trying and failing to be quiet. He was on his feet instantly, pressing his face to the gap in the shutters. 6 riders, torches in hand, surrounding the cabin in a loose circle. And leading them, unmistakable even in darkness, was Marcus Sullivan. Marcus the Ox, they called him. 6 feet 6 inches, 240 pounds, with a burn scar covering the left side of his face from a timber fire 10 years back. He'd been Thorne's enforcer for 20 years, the man who handled problems that couldn't be solved with lawyers or bribes. The man who'd set fire to Nathaniel's cabin 5 years ago, killing Caroline and nearly killing Grace. Marcus's voice rolled across the clearing like thunder. "Blackwood, come out and talk like a man, or we'll burn you out like last time." Nathaniel moved instantly into action, the reflexes of 5 years of vigilance taking over. He grabbed Abigail roughly, dragging her toward the trap door hidden under a rug near the fireplace. "Get Grace and Jake down into the cellar. Follow the tunnel north to Willow Creek. Find Doc Pritchard. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, run." Abigail's hands closed on his shirt, stopping him. "And if you don't come back, then you take care of Grace. That's the arrangement." "No." Her voice shook, but didn't break. "Listen to me, Nathaniel Blackwood. I left the convent. I left God. I left everything to be here. I did not agree to watch you die and raise two children alone. Do you understand me?" He looked at her, really looked, and saw something in her face he hadn't expected. Not fear, anger, fury at the thought of losing him before she'd even had time to know him. "I'll come back." He said it like a promise, like a vow more binding than the one they had spoken in church. Then he grabbed his Winchester, checked the loads, 10 rounds in the magazine plus one in the chamber, and headed for the door. The night air was cold and sharp with the promise of frost. Nathaniel moved to the porch rail, keeping the cabin between himself and the riders, using shadow and timber for cover the way his Cherokee grandfather had taught him. "Marcus, you made a mistake coming here." "Did I?" The big man's laugh was ugly. "Way I see it, you're the one in trouble. You got a pretty new wife, a little girl who can't talk, and a nephew who's barely old enough to shave. Against 6 of us with guns and fire? Those odds don't favor you, Blackwood." Nathaniel's response was to jack around into the chamber of his Winchester, the metallic sound carrying across the clearing like a declaration of war. "First man who throws a torch gets a bullet. Second man gets 2. You want to test how many of you I can drop before you reach the house? We can do that. But some of you are going home in boxes." There was a moment of uncertainty among the riders. They'd come expecting intimidation, not a fight. Marcus tried to rally them. "He's one man. Rush him." That's when the shotgun blast echoed from inside the cabin. Not at them, but straight up into the air. A warning shot that said there were more guns in play than Marcus had counted on. And then Abigail's voice, clear and carrying, "I am the legal wife of Nathaniel Blackwood, registered with the clerk's office in Knoxville. If any of you harm my husband, I will testify in court, and every one of you will hang for murder. You have 10 seconds to leave." Marcus's certainty wavered. A nun's testimony would carry weight, enough weight to overcome even Thorne's influence. And murder was one crime the judge couldn't easily excuse. "This isn't over, Blackwood." Marcus wheeled his horse. "Next time you won't have a nun to hide behind." They vanished into the darkness, taking their torches and threats with them. Nathaniel stood on the porch for a long time after, rifle ready, waiting to see if they'd circle back. When he finally went inside, he found Abigail standing in the main room, his shotgun held in shaking hands like it was a live snake. "You know how to shoot that?" She shook her head. "Not even a little." Despite everything, despite the fear and the danger and the weight of what had just happened, Nathaniel felt something crack in his chest. Not quite a laugh, but close. He took the shotgun from her hands carefully, the way he'd take a weapon from a child. You could have gotten killed if they'd called your bluff. But they didn't. She was trembling now, the adrenaline draining out of her and leaving only the aftermath. "Because you taught me that survival isn't about what you can do. It's about what people believe you can do." He'd never said those words to her, but she'd been listening to everything he told Jake during training, absorbing lessons she'd never planned to use. And when the moment came, she'd use them to save his life. Nathaniel reached out and touched her face, just his fingertips on her cheek. The first gentle contact between them since they'd shaken hands in the barn. "Thank you." 2 words, insufficient for what she'd done. But his voice carried weight that made them mean more than gratitude. They meant recognition, respect, the acknowledgement that she'd proven herself in the way that mattered most in these mountains. When violence came calling, she'd stood her ground. Dawn broke over the ridge like a wound, all red and angry against the November sky. Nathaniel stood in the yard surveying the damage from the night's confrontation. 3 bullet holes in the cabin wall where warning shots had gone wide. Hoof prints churned into mud near the tree line. And worst of all, a section of roof where a torch had briefly caught before Jake managed to douse it with water from the rain barrel. The charred timber sent up thin wisps of smoke that reminded Nathaniel too much of 5 years ago. Abigail emerged from the cabin carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, steam rising in the cold air. She'd been up all night, he knew, sitting with Grace, who'd woken at the sound of gunfire and hadn't gone back to sleep. But her face showed determination rather than exhaustion, the set of someone who'd survived worse than a sleepless night. "How bad?" She handed him a cup. 10 days of work, $500 in materials we don't have. He sipped the coffee, strong and bitter the way he liked it, and 18 days until the hearing. Then we need the evidence now. She spoke with the practical directness he was beginning to recognize as her natural state. Doc Pritchard has the original autopsy report on Caroline. That's our proof Thorne was behind the fire. Nathaniel had reached the same conclusion during the long night. Doc Henry Pritchard had examined Caroline's body after the fire. He'd found accelerant patterns that proved arson, traces of kerosene deliberately poured near the doors and windows to trap anyone inside. But the official report filed with the county had been altered, changed to read accidental death by overturned lamp. Thorne's doing, no question. The judge controlled the sheriff, and the sheriff controlled what went into the official record. Doc lives 15 miles south past Blackwater Falls. Nathaniel set down his empty cup. Jake and I will go. You and Grace stay here. Make it look like nothing's wrong. No, Abigail's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. Marcus knows where we are now. He'll come back with more men while you're gone. I can't defend this place alone. She was right and they both knew it. But splitting up meant leaving someone vulnerable, and every option carried risk. Take Jake with you. Her voice softened. I'll bar the doors and keep the shotgun loaded. If anyone comes, I'll fire a warning shot and head for the cellar tunnel. But you need someone watching your back, Nathaniel. Marcus won't try a direct assault. He'll set an ambush. The use of his full name, spoken with that particular inflection, made something in his chest tighten. She wasn't asking permission. She was stating tactical reality, and she expected him to trust her judgment. All right, he called for Jake, who came running from the barn where he'd been checking on smoke. Saddle the horses. We ride in 10 minutes. They followed the old Cherokee Trail south, a path worn into the mountainside by centuries of feet, before white men came with their deeds and surveys and insistence that land could be owned rather than shared. Jake rode slightly behind and to the right, positioned where he could watch Nathaniel's blind spot. The boy had learned well over the past year, absorbing the lessons of survival that Nathaniel taught by example rather than lecture. 5 miles in, Nathaniel raised a hand and they stopped. He dismounted and crouched by the trail, studying the earth with eyes that could read stories in disturbed leaves and bent grass. Horse tracks. Heavy rider, probably 200 pounds or more. The left rear hoof has a chip on the outside edge. He traced the imprint with one finger. This is Marcus. Could be anyone, Jake suggested. No, Nathaniel pointed to where the tracks diverged from the main trail, heading east toward a rocky outcrop overlooking the path ahead. Marcus is smart. He knew we'd come this way eventually. He's set up where he can watch both directions, see us coming before we see him. So what do? We go around. Nathaniel swung back into the saddle. Through Blackwater Canyon, it'll add 2 hours, but we'll come at Doc's place from the west instead of the north. Marcus will be watching the wrong approach. They descended into the canyon, following the Whitewater Creek that gave the place its name. The gorge was narrow and steep, the kind of terrain where a man on foot had the advantage over a man on horseback. Nathaniel led them along the creek bed itself, letting the water hide their tracks, moving slowly to keep the noise down. Jake followed without question, his young face set with concentration. They emerged near Doc Pritchard's cabin just as the sun reached its peak. The place looked peaceful, smoke rising from the chimney, chickens scratching in the dirt yard. But Nathaniel's instincts, honed by 5 years of vigilance, screamed warning. Something was wrong. The door stood slightly ajar when Doc always kept it barred during the day. The dog that usually announced visitors was silent. Stay with the horses. Nathaniel pulled his Winchester from the saddle scabbard. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, ride for home. Uncle Nate, you should follow orders. The words came out harder than he intended, but Jake needed to learn that bravery without discipline got men killed. Nathaniel approached the cabin from the side, using the chicken coop for cover. He could hear voices inside, low and threatening. One was Doc's, querulous with age and fear. The other was younger, harder, familiar in the worst way. He kicked in the door and brought the Winchester up in one smooth motion. 3 men inside. Doc Pritchard standing against the far wall, his medical bags scattered across the floor. And facing him with pistols drawn were 2 of Marcus's crew, thugs Nathaniel recognized from last night's attack. Drop them. His voice was flat, allowing no room for negotiation. The closer man was stupid enough to turn and raise his weapon. Nathaniel shot him in the shoulder, the .44 caliber round spinning him backward into a shelf of medical supplies that crashed down in a shower of glass and dried herbs. The second man froze, his gun half raised, caught between fight and surrender. Your choice. Nathaniel jacked another round into the chamber. But choose fast. The man dropped his weapon. Nathaniel moved forward, kicked both pistols into the corner, and checked the wounded man. The bullet had gone through meat, missing bone and artery. He'd live, though he'd need his shoulder sewn up. Doc, you hurt? No. Pritchard was 72 years old, his hands shaking from palsy and too much whiskey. They came looking for the Caroline file. Thorne must know you'd come for it. Where is it? Doc moved to his desk and pulled out a false drawer bottom, revealing a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. I've kept this hidden for 5 years. Original autopsy notes, photographs taken with my tintype camera, and a statement from Samuel Green, one of Marcus's men who helped set the fire. Samuel came to me the night after. Couldn't live with what he'd done. He told me everything. Where's Samuel now? Jake had appeared in the doorway despite orders, but Nathaniel was too focused to reprimand him. Doc's face went gray. They found him in the woods 3 days after he talked to me. Single gunshot to the head. Sheriff ruled it a hunting accident. But you know better. Nathaniel took the papers, feeling the weight of evidence that could destroy Thorne or get them all killed depending on who controlled the narrative. I know better. Doc poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey from a bottle on his desk and drank it in one swallow. And I've been waiting 5 years for you to be ready to use it. That's when the window exploded inward and the real ambush began. The glass burst in a shower of fragments, and Marcus Sullivan's voice roared from outside. Blackwood, you're surrounded. Come out with the papers or we burn the cabin with all of you inside. Nathaniel did a quick count. 8 men visible through the windows, positioned in a loose circle around the cabin. Marcus stood directly in front, massive and confident, a Spencer repeating rifle cradled in his arms. The odds were impossible. Even if Nathaniel and Jake fought perfectly, killed 3 or 4 of them, the rest would overwhelm their position or simply set fire to the place and shoot them as they fled. How much ammunition do we have? Nathaniel kept his voice low. 30 rounds in the Winchester, 6 in my pistol, 20 in Jake's rifle. Doc added, I've got a shotgun with 12 shells. But Nathaniel, even if we fight our way out, they'll just hunt us down in the woods. We don't fight our way out. Nathaniel was thinking, running through scenarios the way his grandfather had taught him. In every battle, the man who controls the field controls the outcome. And right now, Marcus controlled the field because he had numbers and position. We hold until help arrives. What help? Jake's voice cracked slightly. Nobody even knows we're here. But Nathaniel smiled, a thin expression that held no humor but plenty of grim satisfaction. Abigail knows. I told her if we weren't back by dark, she'd know something went wrong. It's noon. Dark is 6 hours away. We can't hold that long. Then we make Marcus think we can. Nathaniel moved to the window, staying clear of the line of fire. Marcus, you want the papers? Come get them. But the first man through that door dies, and the second, and however many more it takes until you realize the price is too high. Marcus's laugh echoed across the clearing. Brave words from a trapped man. But I got all day, Blackwood, and fire burns real good in dry timber. As if to punctuate the threat, one of Marcus's men tossed a torch onto the cabin's roof. The dry shingles caught immediately, flames spreading with the hungry speed of a living thing. Smoke began to filter down through the ceiling boards. Jake, get buckets from the back room. Doc, help him. We've got maybe 10 minutes before the smoke gets too thick to see. Nathaniel took up position at the front window, the Winchester steady in his hands. I'll keep them honest. He fired 3 times, not to hit, but to keep Marcus's men from getting comfortable. The first shot kicked up dirt near Marcus's feet. The second shattered a tree branch 2 feet from the nearest rider's head. The third punched through the water barrel they were using for cover, sending a spray of water across their position. The message was clear. I can hit what I aim at. Come closer, and I will. But the fire continued to spread. Smoke filled the cabin now, thick and choking. Jake and Doc threw bucket after bucket of water on the ceiling, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. The heat built, blistering the paint on the walls, making the air itself hurt to breathe. "We have to run." Jake was coughing, his eyes streaming. "Uncle Nate, we can't stay here." Nathaniel knew he was right. In another 5 minutes, they'd be overcome by smoke. In 10, the roof would collapse. But running meant exposing themselves to 8 rifles in a cleared field with no cover. It meant certain death. That's when he heard it. The sound of horses approaching from the west, moving fast. Multiple riders, at least 4 or 5. Marcus heard it too and turned, confusion crossing his scarred face. Then Abigail rode into the clearing on smoke, and behind her came Sheriff Brady and 4 townsmen, all armed. She'd somehow convinced the lawman to do his job, and she'd brought backup that couldn't be ignored or intimidated. "Sheriff Brady!" Abigail's voice cut across the clearing like a blade. "These men are attempting murder. You are required by law to stop them." Brady hesitated. He was on Thorne's payroll, everyone knew it, but he was also a public official, and there were witnesses now. 4 respectable citizens of Morganville who'd ridden with a nun to stop a crime. If he sided with Marcus now, his corruption would be exposed and he'd lose the badge that gave him power. Marcus Sullivan. Brady's voice lacked conviction but carried legal authority. "You and your men stand down. This has gone far enough." "Brady, Thorne gave orders." "I don't care what Thorne ordered." This new voice came from one of the townsmen, and Nathaniel recognized her. Martha Jenkins, the widow whose husband had died in suspicious circumstances 8 years ago. "Tom Brady, you make a choice right now. Do your job, or I tell this whole town you've been taking bribes since the day you pinned on that badge." The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then Marcus lowered his rifle, and his men followed suit. They weren't willing to shoot a sheriff and witnesses in broad daylight, not even for Thorne's money. "This isn't over, Blackwood." Marcus wheeled his horse and led his men into the trees, their retreat more tactical than surrender. Nathaniel emerged from the burning cabin, Doc Pritchard's evidence clutched in one hand, his rifle in the other. Jake stumbled out behind him, coughing and soot-covered, but alive. The roof chose that moment to collapse inward, sending up a column of sparks and ash. Abigail dismounted and walked straight to Nathaniel. Her face was pale, her hands shaking with either fear or fury or both. "You said you'd come back." "I did come back." The cabin was on fire. I could see the smoke from 5 miles away. She grabbed his coat with both hands, her fingers digging into the leather. "Do you have any idea what it's like to ride towards smoke, not knowing if you're going to find bodies or—" He stopped her the only way he could think of. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or romantic. It was desperate and smoke-tasting and entirely inappropriate given that half the town was watching. But Abigail didn't pull away. Her hands released his coat and came up to his face, holding him there for a moment that stretched between heartbeats. When they separated, her eyes were wide. That wasn't part of our arrangement." "I know." His voice was rough. "But I'm done pretending this is just business, Abigail. You rode into a war zone to save me. That's not something a business partner does." She opened her mouth, closed it, then seemed to remember where they were. Sheriff Brady was studiously looking elsewhere, but Martha Jenkins wore a knowing smile. The other townsmen were already gossiping among themselves about what they'd witnessed. "We should get this evidence somewhere safe." Doc Pritchard's practical interruption broke the tension. "And then we need to prepare for trial, because Thorne is going to come at you with everything he has now." They rode back to Nathaniel's cabin in a protective group, Sheriff Brady leading, the townsmen flanking. It was the closest thing to safety they'd had in days, but Nathaniel knew it wouldn't last. Thorne had lost this round, but the man had resources and ruthlessness in equal measure. The real battle was still coming. When they reached the homestead, Abigail went immediately to Grace, who'd spent the day hidden in the cellar as instructed. The child emerged dirty and frightened but unharmed. She saw her father and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, with the desperate strength of someone who'd thought she might never see him again. "It's all right, little bird." Nathaniel used the nickname he hadn't spoken in 5 years, the one Caroline had given their daughter. "Papa's home." Grace pulled back and looked up at him, her lips parted, trembling with the weight of the unspoken words. Every muscle in her small face strained towards sound, but her throat remained locked in the silence that had held her for 5 years. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes as she pressed closer to him, her small fist clutching his shirt. Abigail knelt beside her. Grace, look at me. Words aren't the only way to be heard. Your father knows you love him. He doesn't need words to understand that. But Grace shook her head violently. She looked at Abigail, then at Nathaniel, and her mouth shaped words that carried no sound. I love you. Something broke inside Nathaniel then. 5 years of holding himself together, of being strong because Grace needed him to be strong, of never allowing himself to grieve properly because grief was a luxury he couldn't afford. He sank to his knees in the dirt and pulled both Grace and Abigail into his arms. And for the first time since Caroline died, he wept. The tears came harsh and raw, torn from a place that had stayed locked and frozen for half a decade. Grace clung to him, her small body shaking with sobs of her own. And Abigail held them both, this instant family born from desperation and legal documents, her own tears falling silent into Nathaniel's hair. When the storm passed, they stayed there in the yard as the sun descended toward the western peaks. Sheriff Brady and the others had already left, understanding that this moment was private. Only Jake remained, watching from the porch with the expression of someone witnessing something profound. We have 15 days until the hearing. Abigail's voice was steady again, though her eyes remained red. What's our plan? Nathaniel stood, helping her up, keeping Grace's hand in his. We prepare. Doc's evidence proves Thorne ordered the fire, but we need more. We need to show the court he's been corrupt for years, that this isn't one crime but a pattern. I might be able to help with that. Martha Jenkins had returned, riding up the trail alone. She dismounted and pulled a leather portfolio from her saddlebag. My husband kept records. He knew Thorne was stealing timber from federal land, forging deeds, bribing officials. Daniel planned to expose him. That's why Thorne had him killed. She handed the portfolio to Nathaniel. Inside were ledgers, correspondence, and detailed notes in a careful hand. It was exactly what they needed. Evidence of systematic corruption going back years. Why didn't you use this before? Nathaniel asked. Because I was afraid. Because I had children to protect, and no one would believe a widow over a judge. Martha's face hardened. But I'm done being afraid, and I'm done letting that man destroy families the way he destroyed mine. As darkness fell, they gathered inside the cabin. Nathaniel, Abigail, Grace, Jake, Doc Pritchard, and Martha Jenkins. They spread the evidence across the table. Autopsy reports, photographs, witness statements, financial records. It was damning and comprehensive. The kind of material that could bring down even a man as powerful as Cornelius Thorne. There's still a problem. Doc poured whiskey for everyone except Grace and Jake. Thorne is the presiding judge. He controls the courtroom. Even with all this evidence, he can rule against you and there's no immediate appeal. Then we need a different judge. Abigail was studying the court summons, her finger tracing the legal language. According to Tennessee law, if we can prove bias, we can petition for the case to be heard by a circuit judge from another county. And how do we prove bias? Nathaniel asked. We file a complaint with the State Bar Association. We present evidence that Thorne has a financial interest in the outcome, specifically that he wants your land. She looked up, her green eyes bright with certainty. We have deed records showing he tried to buy your property 5 times in the past year. We have witness statements that his men attacked you. That's enough to establish bias. But filing that complaint will take weeks. The hearing is in 16 days. Well, not if we ride to Nashville tomorrow and file in person. Abigail stood, her decision made. The state capitol is 3 days' ride. If we leave at dawn, we can be there by Thursday, file the complaint on Friday, and get a ruling by Monday. And leave Grace here unprotected? Nathaniel shook his head. No, I won't risk her. You won't have to, Martha spoke up. Grace can stay with me. I have a shotgun, 2 grown sons, and a house in town where there's always people around. Thorne won't dare try anything with witnesses. And I'll stay too, Doc added. Between the 3 of us, we can keep her safe. Nathaniel looked at Grace, who was listening to all of this with the intense focus of a child who understands more than adults' credit. She met his eyes and nodded once, a gesture of trust. All right. Nathaniel made the decision knowing it might be the hardest thing he'd ever done. Abigail and I ride for Nashville at dawn. That night, unable to sleep, Nathaniel sat on the porch watching stars wheel overhead. He was thinking about choices and consequences, about how a man who wanted nothing but to be left alone had been forced into a fight he never asked for, about how grief and anger could burn for 5 years and then suddenly give way to something that felt almost like healing. Abigail came out and sat beside him without asking permission. They'd passed beyond formality now into something neither of them had words for. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Yes. He saw no point in lying. Thorne has money, power, and no conscience. Even with the evidence, he could find a way to win. Then why fight? You could take Grace and disappear into the mountains. Live off the land the way you know how. They'd never find you. Because running means losing. Nathaniel turned to look at her, this woman who'd been a stranger 3 weeks ago and was now the center of his world. "And I'm done losing. Caroline deserves justice. Grace deserves a home, and you deserve better than a life spent hiding. What I deserve and what I want aren't always the same thing." Abigail's hand found his in the darkness. "I wanted to serve God in the convent. What I got was corruption and disappointment. I thought I'd spend my life alone, helping strangers. Instead, I'm here, married to a man I barely know, raising a child who isn't mine, about to ride into a legal battle that could get us all killed. Do you regret it?" She was quiet for a long moment, and Nathaniel felt his heart contract with something that might have been fear. Then she squeezed his hand. "Not for 1 second." They sat in silence after that, hands joined, watching the night sky. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called and was answered. The wind carried the scent of pine and approaching winter, and in the morning they would ride toward whatever fate awaited them in Nashville. But for now, in this moment, there was peace. The kind of peace that comes not from safety, but from having someone to face danger alongside. The kind that makes a man believe he might survive whatever comes next, not because he's strong, but because he's no longer fighting alone. Inside the cabin, Grace slept clutching her wooden doll. Jake maintained watch, his rifle loaded and ready. Doc Pritchard snored softly in the corner, the sleep of the elderly and exhausted. And somewhere out there in the darkness, Marcus Sullivan and his men waited for orders from a judge who'd built an empire on stolen land and murdered innocents. The war wasn't over. It had barely begun. But for the first time in 5 years, Nathaniel Blackwood felt something he'd thought died with Caroline in the flames. Hope. The road to Nashville cut through country that seemed to exist outside of time, a landscape of rolling hills and limestone bluffs where the only evidence of civilization was the rutted track beneath their horses' hooves. Nathaniel and Abigail rode in companionable silence for the first day, conserving energy and attention for the journey ahead. They'd left before dawn, Grace's tearful goodbye still echoing in Nathaniel's chest like a physical wound. By the second day, as they crossed into Davidson County, Abigail began to speak about her past. Not the sanitized version she'd offered when they first met, but the real story beneath the surface. "My father was a bishop." Her voice was steady, matter of fact. "Episcopal, very concerned with appearances and propriety. My mother died of consumption when I was 8. He remarried within 6 months to a woman who saw me as competition for his affection rather than a daughter to be raised. So you went to the convent." I begged to go. She shifted in the saddle, easing muscles sore from 2 days of riding. "I thought God would be kinder than family, and for a while the sisters were. I learned nursing, Latin, how to manage a household. But I also learned that institutions corrupt people just as surely as power does. When Mother Superior started diverting charity funds to build her own estate, I reported it to the bishop, thinking justice would be served." "But your father was the bishop." "He chose reputation over truth, told me I was mistaken, that I'd misunderstood what I saw. When I persisted, he had me declared mentally unstable and sent to an asylum for 3 months. Her hands tightened on the reins. "Do you know what they do to women in those places, Nathaniel? Ice baths, restraints, medications that steal your ability to think clearly, all to make you compliant, to break your will." Nathaniel felt rage building in his chest, the kind that made men do violent things. "How did you get out?" "Father Calloway. He was my father's mentor, and when he heard what had happened, he petitioned for my release. He couldn't reinstate me to the order, but he could give me sanctuary at his mission." She looked at Nathaniel then, her green eyes holding his. He saved my life, and in his final act, he saved it again by sending me to you. They reached Nashville on the afternoon of the third day. The city sprawled across the Cumberland River, a growing metropolis of 30,000 souls, where timber money and railroad commerce met Southern tradition. The streets were packed with wagons and pedestrians, the air thick with coal smoke, and the thousand competing smells of urban life. After weeks in the mountains by millions, the noise and density felt almost overwhelming. They found lodging at a boarding house near the Capitol building, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, who asked no questions about the rough-looking mountain man and the severe woman in traveling clothes, who clearly weren't the romantic newlyweds they claimed to be. 2 rooms, Nathaniel insisted, maintaining the fiction of their arrangement even as something deeper grew between them. That evening, they walked to the Tennessee State Capitol, an imposing Greek revival structure that dominated the city's skyline. The building was closed for the night, but Nathaniel wanted to see the ground where they'd fight their battle come morning. He stood on the steps looking up at the limestone columns and feeling distinctly out of place. I don't belong here. The admission came easier than he expected. I'm a hunter, Abigail. I know how to track deer and read weather signs and survive in places where most men would die. But this? He gestured at the Capitol. Lawyers and judges and legal procedures? This is a different kind of wilderness. Then it's fortunate you brought a guide. Abigail climbed the steps to stand beside him. I may not be a lawyer, but I spent 3 years managing the convent's legal affairs. I know how to file petitions, how to argue procedural matters, how to make bureaucrats listen. She paused. But more than that, I know how to tell the truth in a way that makes people believe it. And that's what we're going to do tomorrow. They filed the bias complaint at 9 o'clock the following morning, presenting their evidence to a clerk who looked barely old enough to shave. The young man examined the documents with increasing interest, his eyes widening as he read witness statements and financial records. By the time he finished, he'd called over his supervisor, who called over the chief clerk of the State Bar Association. Within 2 hours, they were sitting in the office of Attorney General Samuel Whitmore, a silver-haired man of 60 with the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years navigating the treacherous waters of Tennessee politics. This is extraordinary. Whitmore spread the documents across his desk, shaking his head. Judge Thorne has been on the bench for 20 years. He's well-connected, respected in certain circles. If these allegations are true, if we can prove he's been systematically corrupt, it will shake the entire judicial system in this state. They're true, Dishem. Nathaniel's voice carried the flat certainty of someone stating observable fact. Thorne had my wife murdered. He's trying to steal my daughter and my land, and he's been doing similar things to other people for years. Whitmore studied Nathaniel for a long moment, taking in the rough clothes and harder eyes, the way this mountain man sat in the lawyer's office like a wolf in a drawing room. Then he nodded. I believe you, Mr. Blackwood. The question is whether we can get a judge assigned to your case before your hearing in 10 days. That requires approval from the state Supreme Court, and they're notoriously slow. Then we make them move fast. Abigail leaned forward. Attorney General Whitmore, you have the power to petition for emergency judicial review in cases involving potential judicial misconduct. Use it. That's a rarely invoked procedure. For a rarely occurring situation, a sitting judge trying to steal land through fraudulent guardianship proceedings, that warrants emergency action. Abigail's voice was steel wrapped in silk. And if the State Bar Association moves slowly and allows Thorne to preside over his own corrupt case, the newspapers will have a field day. I'm sure the Nashville Banner would love the story. Whitmore's eyebrows rose. Are you threatening to go to the press? I'm promising to go to the press if justice is delayed. She met his gaze without flinching. Your choice, sir. The Attorney General laughed, a surprise bark of sound. You're wasted as a nun, Sister Hart. You should have been a lawyer. He stood and extended his hand. Give me 48 hours. I'll have a ruling by Monday. They left the Capitol building and walked through Nashville's streets in a state of cautious optimism. The petition was filed. The evidence was submitted. Now came the waiting. That peculiar torture of knowing the outcome mattered desperately, but having no control over it. We should send a telegram to Martha, Abigail suggested as they passed the Western Union office. Let them know we filed successfully. They composed a brief message. Papers filed, waiting for ruling. How is Grace? The response came back within an hour. Martha's words crackling across the telegraph wire. Grace well, no trouble. Thorne quiet, too quiet. That last sentence almost sent ice through Nathaniel's veins. He knew Thorne's patterns, the way the judge worked. When he went silent, it meant he was planning something. And if he couldn't attack Nathaniel directly, he'd go after the weakest point. We need to go back. Nathaniel was already moving toward the door. Now, something's wrong. Nathaniel, wait. Abigail caught his arm. We can't leave yet. We need to be here when the ruling comes down. If we're not present to receive it, Thorne could claim we abandoned the petition. Then you stay. I'll ride back. And split our strength? That's exactly what Thorne wants. She held his gaze, her grip on his arm firm. Martha is capable. Doc Pritchard is armed. And Grace is safe in town where there are witnesses. If Thorne tries anything obvious, he exposes himself. Nathaniel wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. Splitting up would weaken both positions. And Abigail was right about the ruling. They needed to be present to receive it or risk losing everything they'd gained. 2 days. His voice was rough. If we don't have an answer by Monday evening, I'm riding back regardless. Monday came with gray skies and the threat of rain. They waited in the Attorney General's office from 9 in the morning until past noon, watching the clock tick toward the deadline for Thorne's hearing. Finally, at 1:15, a messenger arrived with papers bearing the seal of the Tennessee Supreme Court. Attorney General Whitmore read them aloud. In the matter of Blackwood versus Thorne, this court finds sufficient evidence of potential bias and conflict of interest to warrant reassignment of judicial authority. The guardianship hearing scheduled for November 15th is hereby postponed for 1 week and reassigned to Judge Evelyn Westbrook of the Sixth Circuit. Furthermore, Judge Cornelius Thorne is ordered to appear before the State Bar Association to answer allegations of misconduct. So ordered this day, etc. Nathaniel felt something release in his chest that had been clenched tight for weeks. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of standing on solid ground after days at sea. They'd won this round. They had a different judge, one not in Thorne's pocket, and Thorne himself would have to defend against corruption charges. Who is Judge Westbrook? Abigail asked. The first woman to serve on the Tennessee bench. Whitmore's smile was grim. Appointed last year over considerable objection from the old guard. She's brilliant, incorruptible, and absolutely despises men who abuse their authority. If anyone will give you a fair hearing, it's her. They rode out of Nashville within the hour, pushing the horses harder than was wise, but driven by the need to return home. The sky opened up as they crossed back into the mountains, rain falling in sheets that turned the trail to mud and reduced visibility to mere yards. They pressed on anyway, arriving at Nathaniel's cabin near midnight, soaked and exhausted. Martha Jenkins met them at the door with a rifle, relaxing only when she recognized their faces in the lamplight. Thank God, I was about to send Jake to find you. What happened? Nathaniel was already looking around for Grace. Where's my daughter? She's asleep upstairs. She's fine, Nathaniel, but there's someone here you need to see. Martha stepped aside, revealing a man sitting at the kitchen table. He was perhaps 35, dressed in expensive clothes that were mud-splattered from travel. His face held an aristocratic handsomeness, marred by exhaustion and something that might have been shame. When he stood, Nathaniel recognized him immediately from the shape of his jaw and the set of his eyes. Atticus Crane, Thorne's son. Nathaniel had his rifle up and pointed before conscious thought intervened. Give me one reason not to shoot you. Because I'm here to help you destroy my father. Atticus's voice was steady despite the gun aimed at his chest. And because I have evidence that will put him in prison for the rest of his life. The room went absolutely silent except for the drumming of rain on the roof. Abigail moved to stand beside Nathaniel, her hand on his arm, a gentle reminder not to do something irreversible. Talk. Nathaniel didn't lower the rifle. Fast. Atticus reached slowly into his coat and produced a leather-bound journal. This belonged to my mother, Eleanor Crane. She died 10 years ago, allegedly from pneumonia, but she was murdered. My father poisoned her because she discovered his embezzlement of county funds and threatened to expose him. He opened the journal, his hands shaking slightly. She documented everything. Every bribe, every forged deed, every act of violence he's ordered. She hid this before she died, and I found it 2 years ago while clearing out her belongings. I've been gathering corroborating evidence ever since, waiting for the right moment to use it. And that moment is now? Nathaniel's skepticism was evident. Why should I believe you? You're his son. Because he killed my mother. Atticus's voice cracked. Because I watched him become a monster and I did nothing, told myself it wasn't my business, that family loyalty mattered more than justice. But I was wrong. And now I have a chance to make it right. He set the journal on the table and stepped back, hands raised. I'm a lawyer, Mr. Blackwood. I know how to present evidence, how to argue before a court. With what you have from Doc Pritchard and Martha Jenkins, combined with my mother's journal and my testimony, we can bury Thorne so deep he'll never see daylight again. Nathaniel looked at Abigail, seeking her judgment. She studied Atticus carefully, then picked up the journal and began to read. Her eyes moved over the pages, widening as she absorbed the contents. After several minutes, she looked up. This is genuine. The handwriting is consistent throughout, dated over 8 years. And the details, dates, names, amounts of money, they all align with what we already know. She closed the journal carefully. This is the evidence we needed. Or it's an elaborate trap. Nathaniel still hadn't lowered the rifle. Thorne sends his son to gain our trust. We welcome him into our strategy, and he reports everything back to his father. Then test me. Atticus met Nathaniel's eyes without flinching. Let me prove myself. Tomorrow, ride into Morganville and file a formal criminal complaint against Thorne with the county prosecutor. I'll come with you and make a sworn statement against my own father. That's public record. Once I do that, there's no going back. He'll know I've betrayed him, and he'll come after me just as hard as he's come after you. The logic was sound, but Nathaniel had spent too many years trusting his instincts to ignore them now. Something about this felt too convenient, too perfectly timed, but he also recognized that paranoia could be as dangerous as gullibility. You sleep in the barn tonight. Nathaniel finally lowered the rifle. Jake will keep watch. If you try anything, he'll shoot you. In the morning, we'll see if you're as brave in daylight as you are in the dark. Atticus nodded and allowed Jake to escort him out. When they were alone, Nathaniel collapsed into a chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. 3 days of hard riding, the stress of Nashville, and now this unexpected complication. Abigail poured him coffee and sat across from him. What do you think? I think if he's genuine, he's our best chance at putting Thorne away for good. Nathaniel sipped the bitter liquid. And if he's not, we're walking into an ambush tomorrow. So we prepare for both possibilities. Her practicality was becoming something he relied on, a steady counterweight to his own tendency toward action over planning. We go into town armed and alert. We file the complaint in a public place with witnesses. If it's a trap, we'll see it coming. And if it's real, then we've just gained an ally who knows Thorne's methods better than anyone alive. She reached across the table and took his hand. Either way, we're closer to ending this than we've ever been. They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined, drawing strength from contact. Then Abigail stood, stretched, and headed for the stairs. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. Nathaniel, when this is over, when we've beaten Thorne and kept Grace safe, we need to talk about what happens next, about what this marriage is going to be. I know what I want it to be. His voice was quiet but certain. Question is whether you want the same thing. Ask me when we've won. She smiled then, soft and genuine, because I don't make promises I might not survive to keep. The morning came cold and bright, frost coating everything in crystalline white. Atticus emerged from the barn, looking haggard but determined, Jake following close behind with a rifle. They ate a silent breakfast, then saddled horses for the ride into Morganville. The town was busier than usual, market day bringing farmers and merchants from surrounding areas. Perfect cover if Thorne planned an ambush, but also perfect witnesses if Atticus was genuine. They tied their horses outside the prosecutor's office, a small building squeezed between the general store and the barber shop. County Prosecutor Gerald Hammond was a thin man of 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles and the perpetually worried expression of someone who knew his job required more courage than he possessed. When Nathaniel, Abigail, and Atticus walked in, he went pale. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Blackwood, and Mr. Crane. Hammond's eyes darted between them. This is unusual. Gerald, Atticus spoke with the casual authority of someone used to being obeyed. I'm here to file a formal complaint against my father, Judge Cornelius Thorne, for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption. Hammond actually stumbled backward, catching himself on his desk. You can't, he's a judge, and your father, surely there's some mistake. There's no mistake. Atticus laid his mother's journal on the desk. This is documentation of crimes spanning 20 years. Combined with witness testimony and physical evidence, it's enough to convict him multiple times over. Are you going to do your job, Gerald? Or do I need to ride to Nashville and file with the Attorney General instead? The threat of going over Hammond's head did what reason couldn't. The prosecutor opened the journal, read several entries, and his face went from pale to green. Sweet, merciful God. If this is true, if even half of this is true, it's all true, see you. Nathaniel stepped forward. Thorne had my wife murdered 5 years ago. He's been trying to steal my land ever since, and he's done the same or worse to dozens of other people. You've known it for years, Hammond. You just didn't have the spine to do anything about it. Hammond flinched but didn't argue, because it was true. Everyone in the county knew the Thorne was corrupt. They just hadn't known the depth of it, and they'd been too afraid to challenge him. I'll need sworn statements from all of you. Hammond's hands shook as he pulled out the necessary forms. And I'll need to notify the State Attorney General's office. This goes beyond county jurisdiction. Already done. Abigail produced the paperwork from Nashville. The State Bar Association is investigating Thorne as we speak. This criminal complaint will support their inquiry. They spent 2 hours in Hammond's office, dictating statements and signing documents. By the time they finished, it was past noon, and word had spread through town. A crowd gathered outside, drawn by rumor and the magnetic pull of scandal. When they emerged, Nathaniel saw faces he recognized. Shopkeepers, farmers, the blacksmith, the school teacher. People who'd lived under Thorne's shadow for years and were just beginning to realize that shadow might be lifting. Then Sheriff Brady pushed through the crowd, his face red with either exertion or anger. Blackwood, Atticus Crane, you're both under arrest. On what charge? Atticus's lawyer training kicked in immediately. We've committed no crime. Judge Thorne has issued a warrant for conspiracy to defame a public official. Brady held up papers that looked official enough. He claims you fabricated evidence to damage his reputation. Of course he does. Nathaniel didn't resist as Brady produced handcuffs. That's his play. Arrest us before we can present evidence, control the narrative, make us look like criminals. I'm just following orders. But Brady's voice lacked conviction. He knew this was wrong, knew he was being used. But the habit of obedience was strong. Tom Brady, Abigail's voice cut across the murmuring crowd. If you arrest these men for telling the truth, you become complicit in Thorne's crimes. Every person here will remember that when this is over. Brady hesitated, the cuffs hanging open in his hands. The crowd had gone silent, waiting. This was the moment that would define him, Nathaniel realized. The moment where Brady chose between the authority that controlled him and the conscience he'd been suppressing for years. Brady looked at the warrant, then at Nathaniel and Atticus, then at the watching townspeople. I need to verify these charges with the State Attorney General. Until then, you're free to go. It wasn't courage exactly, more like the absence of cowardice. But sometimes that was enough. Thorne played his final card 3 days before the rescheduled hearing. Nathaniel was working in the barn when Jake came running from the house, his face white with panic. Uncle Nate, something's happened in town. It's Grace. Nathaniel didn't remember the next 10 minutes clearly. Just the pounding of Smoke's hooves, the blur of trees passing, the roaring in his ears that might have been blood or rage or terror. When he reached Martha Jenkins' house, he found the front door splintered, clearly forced. Inside, furniture was overturned, and there were signs of struggle. Martha sat on the floor, blood running from a cut on her temple. Doc Pritchard kneeling beside her with his medical bag. But Grace was gone. They came an hour ago. Martha's voice was thick, slurred from the head wound. 6 men, masked. They took Grace, said Thorne wanted to talk to her father, said to come to his estate by sundown or they'd... She couldn't finish the sentence. Nathaniel felt something break inside him, the careful control he'd maintained for weeks shattering like glass. "Where's Abigail?" "She rode after them." Doc's voice was grim. "I tried to stop her, but she just took a horse and went. Said she wouldn't let them hurt that child." The world narrowed to a single point of absolute clarity. Thorne had taken his daughter. Abigail had ridden alone into danger, and Nathaniel was going to kill everyone responsible. "Jake, get the rifles. Doc, you and Martha stay here and send word to Sheriff Brady. Tell him what happened." Nathaniel was already moving towards smoke. "I'm going to Thorne's estate. You'll be walking into a trap." Doc tried to stand, stumbled. "They want you to come. They'll kill you and claim self-defense." "They can try." He rode toward Thorne's estate as the sun descended, painting the sky the color of blood and fire. The judge lived 10 miles south of town on 200 acres of prime land, a plantation-style mansion that spoke of wealth extracted from others. As Nathaniel approached, he saw riders on the perimeter, guards posted to watch for his arrival. He didn't try to hide. He rode straight up the main drive, Winchester across his saddle, making himself a target. Because that was the point. Draw their attention. Make them focus on him while he figured out where they were holding Grace. Marcus Sullivan met him at the gate, sitting on his horse with that same ugly confidence. "Blackwood, didn't think you'd be stupid enough to come alone. Where's my daughter?" "Inside with the judge, and your wife, the pretty nun. She tried to rescue the kid, got herself caught instead." Marcus grinned. "2 birds, 1 stone. You should have stayed in the mountains, friend. You're out of your depth here." Nathaniel studied the layout with a hunter's eye. 3 guards at the gate, 5 more visible around the property. That meant at least 8 men total, probably more inside. The odds were impossible, just like at Doc Pritchard's cabin. But impossible odds had never stopped him before. "Tell Thorne I'm here. Tell him if he's harmed either of them, I'll burn this place to the ground with him inside." Marcus's grin faded. He gestured to one of the guards who rode toward the house. 10 minutes later, word came back. Judge Thorne would see Mr. Blackwood. Alone, unarmed. Not happening. Nathaniel kept his hand on the Winchester. "I keep my weapons or I don't come in." "Then the girl and the nun die." Marcus stated it flatly without emotion. "Your choice, Blackwood." It was the oldest trap in the book. Disarm the dangerous man by threatening what he loves. Nathaniel had walked into it knowing full well what he was doing, because sometimes you had to enter the trap to spring it from inside. He handed over the Winchester, the Colt revolver at his hip, the knife from his belt. But he kept the small blade hidden in his boot, the one Caroline had given him years ago. It was barely 4 inches long, more of a skinning knife than a weapon. But in close quarters, 4 inches was enough to kill a man if you knew where to strike. They escorted him inside, Marcus walking behind with a rifle pressed to his spine. The house was everything Nathaniel expected. Expensive furniture, oil paintings, thick carpets, the kind of wealth that came from stepping on the necks of people who had nothing. Thorne waited in his study, a massive room lined with law books and hunting trophies. Grace sat in a chair beside his desk, bound but apparently unharmed. And standing against the far wall, held between 2 of Thorne's men, was Abigail. Her face was bruised, her dress torn, but her eyes blazed with undiminished fury. "Mr. Blackwood," Thorne looked up from the papers he'd been reading. "Thank you for coming. We have much to discuss." "Let them go." Nathaniel kept his voice level, showing none of the fear and rage churning in his gut. "Whatever this is about, it's between you and me." "Oh, but it's not just about you." Thorne stood and walked around his desk, moving with the confidence of a man on his own ground. "This is about the natural order, about respecting authority, about understanding that some men are meant to lead and others are meant to follow." He stopped in front of Grace, looking down at the child with something that might have been pity. "Your father doesn't understand this, little one. He thinks he can challenge the established order, that his stubbornness matters more than the realities of power. Don't talk to her. Nathaniel took a step forward and immediately had 3 rifles pointed at him. You want to make speeches? Make them to me. Very well. Thorne turned to face him fully. Here's the situation, Blackwood. You've caused me considerable trouble over the past weeks. Filed complaints, gathered evidence, even turned my own son against me. That took resourcefulness and determination, qualities I can almost admire. He pulled a document from his pocket. This is a deed transfer. You sign over your land to me, and I let you, your daughter, and your wife leave. You can go anywhere in the country, start over, live in peace. All you have to do is give up 500 acres you can't possibly defend. No, the answer came without hesitation. I'm offering you your life, Blackwood. More than that, I'm offering you the lives of people that you care about. Don't be a fool. That land, it Grace's inheritance. It's bought with Caroline's blood. I won't sign it away to the man who murdered her. Thorne's expression hardened. Then you'll watch them die before you do, starting with the nun. He nodded to the men holding Abigail. One of them pulled a knife, pressing it to her throat. A thin line of blood appeared where the blade bit into skin. And that's when everything happened at once. Grace, who everyone thought was mute, who hadn't spoken in 5 years, screamed. Not a wordless cry of fear, but actual words, raw and desperate and absolutely clear. Don't hurt her. Please don't hurt my mama. The shock of it froze everyone in the room for one critical second. In that second, Nathaniel moved. He dropped into a crouch, yanked the boot knife free, and threw it in a single fluid motion. The blade took the man holding the knife to Abigail's throat in the eye, dropping him instantly. Abigail didn't hesitate. She slammed her elbow into the second guard's throat, grabbed his gun as he fell, and shot the man nearest the door. Nathaniel was already moving toward Grace, scooping her up and diving behind Thorne's massive desk, and as bullets tore through the air where he'd been standing. The room erupted into chaos. Marcus fired at Nathaniel's last position, the shot splintering wood. Abigail fired back, forcing Marcus to take cover. Thorne dove for a gun rack on the wall. And somewhere in the confusion, Grace wrapped her arms around Nathaniel's neck and whispered words he thought he'd never hear again. I love you, Papa. Don't let him win. The fight lasted maybe 90 seconds, but felt like hours. Nathaniel used the desk as cover, waiting for Marcus to reload. When the big man's rifle clicked empty, Nathaniel launched himself across the room in a tackle that drove them both through the window in an explosion of glass and wood frame. They hit the ground hard, rolled, came up fighting. Marcus was bigger and stronger, but Nathaniel was faster and had 5 years of rage driving every movement. They fought with fists and elbows and knees, brutal and efficient, each trying to kill the other with bare hands. Marcus got on top, his massive hands closing around Nathaniel's throat. Should have killed you 5 years ago. Should have made sure the whole family burned. Nathaniel's vision started to gray at the edges. He could hear gunfire continuing inside the house, could hear Grace screaming for him. With the last of his strength, he drove his knee into Marcus's groin, broke the chokehold, and rolled them over. He hit Marcus 3 times, breaking the man's nose, fracturing his jaw, leaving him bloody and semi-conscious in the broken glass. Then he stumbled back into the house, retrieved his Winchester from where Marcus had dropped it, and pointed it at Cornelius Thorne. The judge stood with his hands raised, his own gun empty on the floor. 2 of his men were down, one dead from Abigail's shot, one unconscious from a blow to the head. The others had fled when the shooting started, unwilling to die for a man who paid them in stolen money. Abigail stood with Grace clutched to her chest, the child sobbing into her shoulder. Blood ran down Abigail's neck from the knife wound, but she was alive and defiant and more beautiful than anything Nathaniel had ever seen. It's over, Thorne. Nathaniel's voice was raw from Marcus's choking. Sheriff Brady is on his way with witnesses. Atticus has testified against you. The evidence is filed with the state bar. You've lost. I'm a judge. Thorne's voice shook for the first time. You can't do this to me. I have friends, powerful friends who will distance themselves the moment they realize you're going down. Nathaniel saw no point in cruelty, but he wouldn't allow delusion either. It's done. You'll stand trial for murder, corruption, kidnapping, and when you're convicted, you'll hang. Brady arrived 20 minutes later with a dozen armed men, including Atticus Crane and Attorney General Whitmore himself. The Attorney General had ridden from Nashville when word reached him of Grace's kidnapping, bringing with him arrest warrants and the full authority of the state. They took Thorne away in chains, the judge who terrorized a county for 20 years, reduced to a prisoner cursing and spitting as he was loaded into a wagon. Marcus and his surviving men were arrested as accomplices. And through it all, Grace clung to Abigail, this woman who wasn't her mother by blood, but had proven herself worthy of the title through action and love. The trial took place 3 weeks later in Knoxville, presiding Judge Evelyn Westbrook proving herself everything Whitmore had promised. She allowed no theatrics, no manipulation, no appeals to sentiment over evidence. The facts spoke for themselves: autopsy reports, financial records, witness testimony from Atticus and Martha and Doc Pritchard. On the fourth day of testimony, Grace took the stand. She spoke haltingly at first, her voice rusty from 5 years of silence, telling the court what she'd seen the night her mother died. The man in the dark coat standing in the yard, watching the house burn. The laughter she'd heard as timbers fell. The face she now recognized as belonging to Cornelius Thorne. The jury retired to deliberate at 4 in the afternoon. By midnight, they had not returned. Nathaniel sat on a bench in the courthouse hallway, Grace asleep with her head on his lap, Abigail beside him with her hand in his. Atticus paced the marble floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. Doc Pritchard had fallen asleep sitting upright, his medical bag clutched to his chest. Martha Jenkins prayed silently, her lips moving around words only God could hear. At 2 in the morning, Judge Westbrook's clerk emerged with news that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. The jury is deadlocked. 6 for conviction, 6 for acquittal. If they cannot reach consensus by morning, Judge Westbrook will be forced to declare a mistrial. What does that mean? Grace asked, suddenly awake. It means Thorne goes free. Nathaniel's voice was hollow. Until a new trial can be scheduled, which could take months, years, or never. Atticus stopped pacing, his face gray. My father's lawyers will file motion after motion. Delays, appeals, jurisdictional challenges. He could die of old age before facing justice. Abigail's hand tightened on Nathaniel's. All the evidence, all the sacrifice, all the testimony, and it might end with Thorne walking out of the courthouse a free man. At dawn, Judge Westbrook reconvened the court. The jury filed in looking exhausted and divided. The foreman, a weathered farmer named Robert Mills, stood. Your Honor, we are unable to reach a unanimous verdict. Then I have no choice but to, Westbrook began. Wait. Mills raised his hand. Before you declare a mistrial, may we request one thing? May we hear from Miss Grace Blackwood one final time? Just to answer a single question? Westbrook looked at Nathaniel, who nodded slowly. Grace walked to the witness stand for the second time, climbing onto the chair because she was still too small to be seen over the rail otherwise. Miss Grace, Mills said gently. He was a grandfather himself, his voice soft. You told us you saw Judge Thorne standing in the yard the night your mother died. You said he was watching the house burn. I have one question, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Did Judge Thorne know you saw him? Grace looked at the foreman, then her eyes moved slowly across the courtroom until they found Cornelius Thorne, sitting at the defense table between his lawyers. The old judge stared back at her, his face a mask of aristocratic contempt, his eyes cold and flat as river stones. For a long moment, girl and judge locked eyes across the space that separated victim from perpetrator, innocence from corruption, truth from power. Yes. Grace's voice was small but perfectly clear. He looked right at me. I was standing in the door with Mama pushing me outside. The fire was all around us, and he saw me watching him. And what did he do when he saw you? Grace's hands gripped the witness rail, her knuckles white. He smiled at me. The courtroom erupted. Someone in the gallery screamed, others shouted in outrage. Judge Westbrook's gavel came down like thunder, demanding order, but the chaos continued for a full minute before she could restore control. He smiled at a 3-year-old child watching her mother burn to death. Mills's voice shook. You're certain? Yes, sir. Tears ran down Grace's face. I remember because I didn't understand. I thought maybe he was there to help us. But then he got on his horse and rode away while Mama screamed and the roof fell down. Mills nodded slowly. Thank you, Miss Grace. That's all I needed to know. The jury returned to deliberation. 20 minutes later, they emerged with a verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Cornelius Thorne, guilty on all charges. The smile, that single detail, the smile of a man watching a child's world burn, had broken the deadlock. 6 jurors who'd been willing to give a respected judge the benefit of doubt could not reconcile that image with innocence. Judge Westbrook sentenced Thorne to life in prison, citing the systematic nature of his crimes and his abuse of judicial authority. Standing in the courtroom as the sentence was read, Nathaniel felt something he'd been carrying for 5 years finally release. Not joy exactly. Justice wasn't joyful when it came so late. But closure. The sense that Caroline could rest now, that Grace would grow up safe, that the debt of blood had been repaid with legal consequence, rather than more violence. Atticus approached them outside the courthouse, his face showing the complicated emotions of a man who just helped imprison his own father. I don't expect forgiveness, Mr. Blackwood. What my family did to yours is unforgivable. But I hope that someday you might accept that not all of us are monsters. You did the right thing. Nathaniel extended his hand. That's all any of us can do. They shook, and Nathaniel saw something in Atticus's eyes that might have been relief. The younger man nodded once, then walked away to begin whatever life awaited him after destroying his father's legacy. The final truth came 3 days later, discovered by accident rather than intention. Abigail was sorting through Father Calloway's belongings that Martha had preserved in a trunk, his Bible, vestments, and personal papers that would eventually go to the Baptist mission in his memory. As she lifted the old leather-bound Bible, something slipped from between its pages and fell to the floor. A sealed envelope, yellowed with age, written across it in Calloway's distinctive hand, for Nathaniel Blackwood, to be opened only after justice is served. She brought it to Nathaniel, who was working in the barn with Jake. He took the envelope with hands still dusty from sawing timber, broke the wax seal, and read by the slanting afternoon light that fell through the barn door. The letter was dated 2 weeks before Calloway's death. My dearest Nathaniel, if you are reading this, then Thorne has fallen, and you have won the battle I was too cowardly to fight. But you deserve to know the complete truth, the sin I have carried for 30 years and could never speak aloud while I lived. Your mother, Sarah Blackwood, did not die of fever in 1854, as I told you when you were old enough to ask. She was murdered, poisoned with arsenic mixed into her tea by Cornelius Thorne the elder, the current judge's father. Sarah owned the 500 acres free and clear, inherited from her Cherokee husband after he died. The elder Thorne wanted that land for timber rights. When she refused to sell, he killed her and forged documents claiming she died intestate with no heirs. I was a newly ordained priest, barely 25, and I was terrified. Thorne Sr. made it clear that if I spoke against him, I would be next, so I stayed silent. I watched him steal your inheritance. I watched him grow rich on land bought with your mother's blood, and I hated myself every day for 30 years. When I finally had money of my own, I used every cent to buy back those 500 acres and register them in your name. But I could never buy back your mother's life or the childhood you should have had growing up, knowing you were loved and wanted. The Thorne family has spilled Blackwood blood across 2 generations. The father killed your mother. The son killed your wife. It is a blood debt that spans 30 years, and in defeating Cornelius Thorne Jr., you have done what I never had the courage to do. You have ended the cycle. I sent Abigail to you not just to save Grace from the law, but to give you what I failed to give your mother: a family, protection, love. She is my final act of penance, my last attempt to repay a debt that can never be fully settled. Forgive me, Nathaniel. I failed your mother. I pray I have not failed you. Your uncle, in blood if not in courage, Edmund Calloway. Nathaniel read the letter 3 times, his hands perfectly steady. When he finished, he folded it carefully and looked at Abigail, who had been reading over his shoulder. 2 generations, he said quietly. Thorne's father killed my mother for this land. His son killed Caroline for the same reason. And you ended it. Abigail touched his arm. You broke the cycle, Nathaniel. The land is Grace's now. The Thornes are finished. Should I tell her? He looked toward the cabin where Grace was helping Jake split kindling. That her grandmother was murdered for the ground she's standing on? Someday. Abigail took the letter from his hands. When she's old enough to understand that evil can echo across generations, but so can the courage to end it. For now, let her remember Caroline and Father Calloway with love. That's enough. That evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks, Nathaniel built a small fire in the yard. He held the letter over the flames, watching Calloway's confession curl and blacken. "What are you doing?" Grace had come out to watch, Abigail beside her. "Letting go of the past." Nathaniel dropped the letter into the fire. "Your great-grandmother and your mother are at peace now. We don't need to carry their pain anymore." Grace slipped her hand into his, then reached for Abigail's hand with the other. The three of them stood watching the letter burn to ash, the words and sins and sorrows of 2 generations rising as smoke into the clear mountain air. "What matters isn't where we came from," Nathaniel said, pulling both Grace and Abigail close. "It's where we're going, together." Winter came to the Appalachian Mountains with cleansing snow that covered the scars and made everything clean. Nathaniel spent the season repairing the cabin, adding a second bedroom, and reinforcing the roof against weather. Jake helped with the work, learning carpentry the way he'd learned hunting, through observation and practice and patient correction when he made mistakes. Grace's voice grew stronger every day. She chattered now, making up for 5 years of silence, with questions and observations and the natural exuberance of a 9-year-old discovering the world. She called Abigail Mama without prompting or permission, and Abigail accepted the title with grace and visible emotion. On a February evening with snow falling soft outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, Nathaniel found himself sitting with Abigail on the porch they'd built together. Grace was inside teaching Jake a song she'd learned, their voices blending in harmony that spoke of family formed through choice rather than blood. "Remember what you said in Nashville?" Nathaniel kept his eyes on the falling snow. "About needing to talk when this was over?" I remember." Abigail's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "We won. Thorne's in prison. Grace is safe. The land is ours, so I'm asking." He turned to face her, this woman who'd been a stranger 4 months ago and was now the center of his world. "What do you want this marriage to be?" Abigail was quiet for a long moment, and Nathaniel felt his heart clench with something that might have been fear. Then she spoke. "I want it to be real. I want to be your wife in every sense, not just on paper. I want to raise Grace together, grow old together, build a life together." She squeezed his hand. "But I need you to understand what you're asking for." "I was trained to serve God, Nathaniel. I don't know how to be a traditional wife. I'll challenge you, argue with you, probably drive you mad with my stubbornness." "I'm counting on it." He smiled, the expression coming easier now than it had in years. "I don't want a traditional wife. I want you. Stubborn, argumentative, impossibly brave you." "Then ask me properly." Her eyes held his. "Not because Father Calloway arranged it, not because we needed to fool a judge. Ask me because you want to, and I'll answer because I want to." Nathaniel stood, pulled her up with him, and there on the porch of the cabin he'd built with his own hands, he knelt in the snow. "Abigail Rose Hart Blackwood, will you marry me? Really marry me with love and intention and the promise of whatever years we have left?" "Yes." She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, deep and certain and full of promises neither of them needed to speak aloud. They married again 3 weeks later, this time in the small Baptist church with the entire town as witness. Grace stood beside them in a new dress Martha Jenkins had sewn, holding a bouquet of early wildflowers. Jake served as best man, his young face showing pride in the family he'd helped protect. Doc Pritchard gave Abigail away, Doc who'd saved evidence and risked his life to see justice done. When Reverend Mills asked if anyone objected, the silence was absolute and approving. And when Nathaniel kissed his bride this time, it wasn't obligation or theater. It was love. Hard-won and dearly bought, the kind that survives fire and corruption and every form of adversity. The seasons turned, bringing healing in their rhythm. Spring came first, with Abigail planting a garden that was more than survival. Roses climbed the porch rails, wildflowers bordered the path, beauty reclaiming ground that had known only hardship. Grace helped her plant each seed, learning the names of flowers in Latin and English both, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. Summer brought Doc Pritchard's final visit. He rode up on a borrowed horse, too weak to manage the journey alone but determined to see them one last time. "I'm dying, Nathaniel," he said without preamble. "Got maybe 2 months, but I wanted to see you all happy before I go." They spent 3 days together, Doc teaching Grace the basics of medicine, while Nathaniel and Abigail listened. On the last evening, Doc pulled Nathaniel aside. "You did what I couldn't," the old man said. "You stood up, you fought, you won." He gripped Nathaniel's hand with surprising strength. "Your mother and Caroline can rest now, and so, I think, can I." He died 6 weeks later. They buried him on the ridge overlooking the valley, next to the small plot where Caroline lay. Nathaniel carved both headstones himself, the chisel work careful and precise. Here lies a man who chose truth when lies were easier. Autumn brought news from Nashville. Thorne had died in prison, not from old age or illness, but killed by another inmate in a fight over gambling debts. The man who'd built an empire on violence had ended his life the same way, unmourned and alone. "Should I feel something?" Nathaniel asked Abigail when the letter arrived. "Satisfaction? Relief?" "You feel nothing because you let go of the hate." She took his hand. "That's not emptiness, Nathaniel. That's peace." Winter came again, and with it Jake's wedding. He married Lily Morrison, the blacksmith's daughter, in the same Baptist church where Nathaniel and Abigail had married twice. Grace stood as maid of honor, wearing a blue dress Abigail had sewn, her voice clear and bright as she sang hymns that had once seemed impossible. "Uncle Nate taught me everything," Jake said in his toast, his young face serious. "How to track, how to shoot, how to survive. But Aunt Abigail taught me something more important. She taught me what's worth surviving for." That night, as snow fell soft outside their cabin, Nathaniel sat with his family around the fire. Grace was reading aloud from the Leather-Stocking Tales, the same book he'd learned from as a child. Her voice stumbled occasionally on difficult words, but she pushed through with a determination that was pure Blackwood stubbornness mixed with heart courage. Abigail sat beside him, her hand in his, her head resting on his shoulder. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and uncaring, but inside there was warmth and light and the sound of a child's voice weaving stories into the darkness. "Are you happy?" Abigail whispered. Nathaniel looked at Grace, at the fire, at the home they'd built from ashes and determination and improbable love. "Yes," he said. And meant it without reservation. 10 years later, a stranger riding through the Appalachian Mountains might stop at a prosperous homestead where a man in his mid-40s worked with 2 teenage children, teaching them to read the weather and respect the land. Where a woman ran a small clinic treating mountain families too poor for doctors in town. Where smoke rose from a well-maintained chimney and the sound of laughter carried on the wind. The stranger wouldn't know the story behind that peace, wouldn't know about the judge who tried to steal it all, or the nun who'd given up heaven for earth, or the child who'd found her voice in the moment her family needed it most. They'd just see a family, prosperous and content, living the kind of life that looked easy from the outside. But Nathaniel Blackwood knew better. He knew peace wasn't the absence of struggle, but the presence of people worth fighting for. He knew family wasn't always blood, but sometimes choice and commitment, and showing up every day with open hands and willing hearts. And he knew that justice, when it finally came, was worth every sacrifice required to achieve it. Grace grew up to become a teacher, then a doctor, using the education her parents insisted she receive to serve the mountain communities that had sheltered them. Jake married and had children of his own, passing down the skills Nathaniel taught him. Doc Pritchard died peacefully at 85, knowing he'd lived long enough to see corruption defeated and good people triumph. And Nathaniel and Abigail grew old together in the cabin overlooking the Appalachian Valley, watching their family expand and the legacy of their struggle bear fruit in ways they couldn't have imagined that desperate autumn when everything had hung in the balance. On quiet evenings, Nathaniel would sit with his grandchildren and tell them stories. Not fairy tales, but true stories about courage and justice and what it means to stand for what's right even when standing alone. About a man who lost everything and found it again in unexpected places. About a woman who chose truth over comfort and paid the price gladly. about a child who found her voice at the moment it mattered most. And the children would listen, wide-eyed and silent, learning the lessons their grandfather had learned in Blood and Fire. That family is worth fighting for, that justice is worth pursuing, and that love, when it comes, is worth every sacrifice required to keep it. The mountains stood eternal above them, ancient and unchanging, bearing witness to one small family's triumph over darkness. And in the valley below, smoke rose from 100 cabins where people lived free because one man refused to bend and one woman refused to be silenced. That was legacy enough, the end.